somebody's listening. You guys are out there, so let's keep going. And again, those donations really make life much simpler, and it is all greatly appreciated. I just found out, because I probably live in my little cubicle, that there was a tornado that went through part of southern Michigan just yesterday, which threw out the power here, which meant they had to readjust a bunch of stuff. I was in my office, and then my daughter told me later it poured. I missed it. Left the office, walked, took a shortcut, so went outside, back inside, went to the business office, and then I heard it pouring and checked my car, and thank God the windows were closed. But I didn't hear about any tornadoes. Some friends lost power, but tornadoes, that's power. Whoa. A tornado is real power. When you think of something really powerful, perhaps something really frightening, you might think of a tornado. But and that's what we want to spend a lot of time talking about. The Shavuot holiday is next week. And we're going to explain this word, a seminal moment in the Jewish people, and not only Jewish people, but really world history. And that moment when God comes down on Mount Sinai, just even looking at the descriptions in the Torah, that is frightening. That's not just a tornado. That is amazing. Just try to draw a picture in your mind. We have what the verse says, we have what some of the rabbis say, with a caveat, a fascinating caveat. I spend a lot of time explaining it to my students. And that is, God is spiritual. Coming down, he created this world. So trying to describe that spiritual, physical power is really beyond our comprehension. So what the Torah will do is it will use things that we are familiar with. It says the mountain was smoking like a fiery furnace. I tell my kids in class, I say, because if you drive from here towards New York, towards New Jersey, you actually pass by, I don't know if it's a nuclear reactor or something, but there's these huge smokestacks, humongous. And the smoke that comes out of them is pouring into the sky. So you just have to imagine this mountain, that smoke is just pouring off it in a way that you can't imagine. And there's lightning, and there's thunder. And the verse tells us the mountain is shaking. And there's this shofar blast that not only is blasting. Now, I'm a pretty good shofar blower, but if you know anything about any air instrument, the longer you're trying to blow, you start running out of oxygen. And either you just give it a strong stop or you just fade away, right? And here the verse tells us that the blast of this shofar was getting stronger and stronger and stronger. So there's noise and lightning and clouds and trembling and just awesomeness as God brings his presence down to give the Jewish people the Torah. And it was part of the plan. In other words, the Jewish people have to know what's going on, right? God is giving the Jewish people his Torah, the greatest present you could ever give. It's the Word of God. It's how God thinks. It's how he wants us to think. It's how he wants us to act. So this is a one-time, never to be repeated event ever again. The greatest event in human history, that God talks to millions of people. Throughout history, it doesn't mean there weren't prophets. It doesn't mean there weren't miracles, crossing the Red Sea and the 10 plagues and numerous stories throughout history of God doing miracles, but never God revealing himself in such a way to a whole nation, which is why I tell you, it wasn't just a seminal moment for the Jewish people. It's a seminal moment for the world. No one, I don't want to say no one, billions of people today believe it happened. Well, the Christians believe it happened. Or the Muslims believe it happened. Because they know when there's millions of witnesses, right? It goes back, obviously, 3,000 years, 3,300 years. Right? It took place in the Jewish calendar 2448, and we're at 5784. So you do the math, right? 3340. Right? So it's, we're not saying it doesn't go back deep into history. It goes back in history. But when so many people see a story, so why 50 years later did nobody stand up and say it never happened? 100 years later, no one stood up and said it happened. Because you have all those witnesses. Anybody who today is not interested in religion, and I tell friends all the time, those that don't want to believe that it happened is because if you believe that God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, and you know that's what God wants, then how are you not listening? But if I say, very pithy, right? If I say, I don't want to believe, you're really saying, I'm not interested in the rules and regulations. How could I say I'm not interested in the rules and regulations? I don't believe it happened. Like, it's a little silly, right? I mean, you don't believe it happened, and you're basing that on, you're really basing it on the fact that you're not interested in following the rules. Because if you believe, you got to follow the rules. Okay, so I won't believe it, I don't have to do it. The easiest out that exists for many, many people. And even, right, so even the Christians, the Muslims, that they all believe it took place. Right? They believe in the Old Testament. They even copy some of the Old Testament in their New Testament, in their Quran. But they wanted to start their own religion, so each one has their prophet, their leader, who says God changed his mind. And I say, if God told millions of people that he wants us, he can't go to one person in a dream and say he changed his mind. Come and tell us you changed your mind. Okay, we get it. But until that time, he didn't change his mind. We'll just keep things the way they are. So it is fascinating because what happens is, just to give you an idea of what's happening historically in this week. So the Jewish people arrive at Mount Sinai. I was reading somewhere, if you dive into the verse, it almost sounds like they didn't even get all the way up to Mount Sinai. As soon as they were close, they started unpacking to get ready for the giving of the Torah. That's what it sounds like. And so Moses is going to go up, and the first day the people just prepare themselves, and Moses goes up, and God talks to him, and Moses brings down the message, and he asks the Jewish people, do you want the Torah? And the first time they say, we'll do whatever you tell us. Second time, because Moses said that's good, but you could do better. And the better is, we'll do, but we're not robots. We will do, and we will hear. Now, it's not we're going to listen first and decide, but we're going to do no matter what. But our job is to try as deep as we could to understand what God wants. I actually just saw yesterday that every child in the mother's womb is taught the entire Torah. They come out of the womb and they forget everything. What are they being taught? So what they're being taught is everybody is given his part of Torah, that he can have not I don't say creative, but if he or she is going to work to understand Torah, they're going to have a clarity in certain areas that other people may not. Right? God's giving every single person his portion in Torah. Torah is humongous. There's a beautiful piece of poetry that is read before we read the Torah Shabbat morning, where those of us who stay up all night are. I know that piece of poetry is long, and sometimes it's a little hard to keep the eyes open. But that poetry is describing the day of the giving of the Torah, and describing the Torah and saying it is so wide and so humongous, and if all the seas were ink and all the trees were pens and everybody were scribes, we could never finish describing the the amazing Torah, God, everything. It's indescribable. It takes forever. It's just unending. The depths of Torah is unending. You have to learn it to appreciate it. Where you can learn very, very shallow, or you can choose to dive in. And the more you dive in, and the more you know, the more you see there is to talk about. Right? You could do it simple. You could do it easy. You could do it fast. Or you could try to get deep down what's going on. And sometimes here we try to do both. So the Jewish people are there. Moses comes down and he tells them, okay, so God's going to come down in a cloud and he's going to give the Torah to me. And you're going to see that God is talking to me. You're not going to understand what's going on. But you're going to understand and recognize that God is giving me the Torah, and then I will then transfer the Torah to you guys. So the Jewish people's reaction was fantastic. The reaction was, whoa, 1 second. We want God to talk to us. The Hebrew phrase is Ritzonenu Lirois Es Malkeinu. We want God to talk to us. Moses says, great. Let me go back and repeat the message. Moses goes back up. God says, amazing. I don't know if he used the word amazing. He says, but if they want me to come and talk to all of them, they got to be prepared. They got to make themselves more holy. They got to wash their clothes like it's a holiday. There was preparation to be ready. We got to set up boundaries for the mountain. Because if we just see God talking to Moses in a cloud, okay, so whatever, not major. But if we want God to talk to us, first of all, we need to up our game. And we have to understand that mountain is going to be very holy. And our souls are going to be desperate to go up on that mountain. But we're not allowed. The verse says you got to warn the Jewish people. You got to prepare them. We got to set up boundaries. We got to set up fences. We got to set up barricades. We got to re-warn the Jewish people they cannot go on Mount Sinai. They go on Mount Sinai, death penalty. Why would somebody want to go up when he's warned there's a death penalty? So this is also, believe it or not, historical. I told a friend the other day, in the first temple, there were upwards of 18 high priests, which averages out a little over 20 years per high priest during the first temple period. Some say there were like 14 or 11. But in either case, the high priest lasted a very long time. In the second temple, you had the first 40 years was Shimon HaTzadik. You had Yochanan Kohen Gadol, who was like 80 years, which, by the way, leaves you with less than 300 years to the second temple, because the whole second temple was 420. And the Talmud tells us there were over 300 high priests. And they paid for the honor, because the Romans were in control. You wanted to be high priest, you gave a nice tribute, a chest filled with gold or diamonds or rubies or whatever qualified as a tribute, and the job was yours. If there were 300, that meant they didn't last long. Going to go into the Holy of Holies. It doesn't belong in the Holy of Holies. You're going to die. Some were lucky enough to get out and then die. Some just died there. Why are they dying? Their soul so much desired to leave their body because their body wasn't on the right level to handle that holiness. The body is not able to handle that holiness. The soul is. The soul leaves. That's it. So you got to wonder, right? After the first 50, every year, and sometimes 2 a year, keep dying. So why do you want the job? 100. For the last 100 years, every priest that goes into the Holy of Holies dies. And some don't even make it that far. So why do you want the job? Like, what are you, crazy? Which is probably how most of us feel. But there was this idea, this concept, that people believed it's worth dying to get that extra supercharged closeness level of spirituality and that closeness to God. That's what people wanted. God says, that's not what I want. I want you to live and be holy. If it's above what you're ready to handle, don't go there. What are you going there for? So the same idea around the mountain. People will have a natural tendency to desire and be willing to die to get that extra holiness. God keeps warning, don't die for the extra holiness. Obviously, there are times where a person has to give up his life not to do certain sins, the 3 cardinal sins, murder and adultery and idol worship. Fine. That's not giving up my life for holiness. That's giving up my life to follow God's laws. It's totally separate. So you even had, by the way, in the temple and by the tabernacle, by the Mishkan, where the Levites, they weren't just an honor guard. Their job was to keep people away from where they don't belong going. They had to stand there with their baseball bats or clubs, because there were those that would do anything to get an extra taste of holiness. They're not allowed to go there. They could get killed. That's not what God wants. So you need guards. You need soldiers. That's why you look at the encampments. The tribe of Levites surrounded the temple. There were no walls. There were simple curtains. You crawl under the curtain if you want. So you need guards. So the bottom line is, we wanted that holiness. God comes down. Every word that leaves God's mouth, our souls flew out of our bodies anyways. And our bodies jump back. The Talmud says 12 mil. 12 mil is approximately 24,000 amos, 24,000 cubits, about 48,000 feet. So you do the math. I don't know, what is that? 8 miles? Somewhere in that range. 8 miles, 7.5 miles, something like that. And angels would come down and they would bring us back to life and they would schlep us back and God would say another word. And again, our souls would explode out. We managed to hear 2 of the 10 commandments. The first 2, I am God and no idol worship. A few more words than that, but that's what we managed. We went to Moses, we said, we know we asked God to talk to us. We can't handle it. Now that tells you, by the way, how great, how pure Moses must have been. Because Moses talks to God face to face. He doesn't keep losing his soul every time he talks to God. So Moses is this unusual, special soul that can talk to God, not in dreams. He can stand, God talks to him, and he can answer back. This is an unusual type of prophet, and there is one of the 13 principles of faith is there is no prophet like Moses, and I think that's, for the most part, pretty much self-understood. So Moses says, okay, I'll go up the mountain. God will give me the other 8. I'll come back and tell them to you. But don't feel bad. And God knew you couldn't handle it. So, of course, the question is, if God knew he couldn't handle it, why bother? Like, what's the point? What's the whole point? So the answer is, it's called Ba'avor Nasais Eschem. That God wanted to lift you up. You are so special, Jewish people that were at Mount Sinai. You are so special. God talked to you. If you are so special that God talked to you, there's a lot expected from you. You are special, and therefore you and your children, and it's like in your DNA that we're special. God spoke to us. That made us special. That gave us responsibilities. That gave us the ability to accept God's Torah, learn God's Torah, and remember every time we're doing something. You know, it's not a perfect example, but I've told the story before about a certain senator, and his wife died. And on the tombstone, the senator had the names of, I think, his 3 children written down. And he brought his children to the cemetery, and he says, you know, your mother was a special person. And I put your names down on this tombstone as her descendants. But let me tell you something. If you ever dare embarrass her memory, I'm calling the stone guy, and he's erasing your name from here. Don't you ever embarrass your mother. And we really should have that same thought, right? Don't you ever dare embarrass God, right? God spoke to you. Don't embarrass him. Do what you're expected to do. So that's this, Ba'avur Nazar, in order to lift you up. So there are no specific commands connected to the holiday of Shavuot. No specific commands. Like Passover has matzah, and Sukkot has the pomegranates, the lulav and the etrog, and you have to be in a sukkah. Okay, Chanukah and Purim, we know about those, but those are not for the Torah. Shavuot has no specific command except really to be happy. Today we have a command to be happy that we're serving God. We have the opportunity to have a holiday. But it does have 5 famous customs. One we spoke about before, Akdamos, right? That famous long piece of poetry that synagogues throughout the world will read that before they read from the Torah on Shavuot morning. Milk. We drink milk products. We eat milk products. You know, it's famous for cheesecake. Every year I talk to you about cheesecake. But the idea being, first of all, milk it represents Torah. That's one answer. Also, there's a question now that we got the Torah, so now we can't eat meat. We have to learn how to slaughter, and we have to learn how to salt and get out the blood and what makes an animal kosher and not kosher. But milk is easy, right? You milk the cow, you scramble some eggs. That's so hard. So people will have some milk products. The story of Ruth is read, which in the next show we're going to spend a lot of time going through that story. We have flowers in synagogue. A lot of synagogues have flowers or grass. It reminds us that Mount Sinai was covered in flowers, and we've talked about that before in the past. And people have a custom to stay up the whole Shavuot night, studying Torah. By Chassidim, there's a special book of pieces of Torah called Tikkun Shavuos. That's what their custom is to read. In non-Chassidic circles, they'll just study something. It's all different customs. So interesting, before as we say, the bell rings, Rezev Lev says they all actually have a common denominator. And that is, nothing comes for free. You got to put effort in. Learning Torah, doing God's commands is a process. Nothing important just happens. You got to prepare. Akdamos is a long introduction, right? Right? Before you can even start that Torah study, right? If you think about milk, who do we give milk to? Babies get milk. They need it for growth. They need it for development. The story of Ruth we're going to talk about, but that was the process to get us to the Messiah. Flowers and grass, everybody knows flowers and grass, right? You got to grow, right? I have my sod in the back and my trees and my flower up front, and we're constantly watering them, and my wife has her flowers and she's deadheading it takes time and effort to grow. And certainly studying all night long is, again, an effort. In other words, we live in a world, right, where people almost expect. You just broke your arm. Just because they put the cast on or the brace doesn't mean you're all better. There's a process. Things don't happen in 5 seconds because you wish it so. And with that thought, there is the music, and I hope you enjoyed it, short and sweet. Thank you, of course, to a wonderful sponsor listener. I can't do it without you. Thank you to the wonderful production team. We have Alan in the back today. I hope I've left you with some food for thought. Until next time, I am Rabbi Tzvi Jacobson. You've been listening to Let's Talk Torah on NRM Streamcast. Until next time, don't forget to think about it.
I ask, how did this tradition get started? I'll tell you. I don't know.
But it's a tradition. And because of our traditions, every one of us knows who he is and what God expects him to do.
TalkTorah.net. The archives are there. Audio, video, questions, comments, even guests that want to be on the show. That's really a good place to send us an email. We all get that email. And of course, the all-important donate button. We have different levels, and your donations, of course, are greatly appreciated. They help us spread Torah to people. They get the message out. We know we have a nice amount of listeners. Clearly, as we keep mentioning, a feed spot. I'm sorry. There's a web page called FeedSpot, and they track podcasts. So if you want to find out how many people are listening, there's hundreds of different platforms out there that you just can't track it. So, but there's an organization like FeedSpot, and they do a lot of tracking, and we are in their top 3 for the 10 best Jewish book podcasts, which we accept and thank them for giving us that information. So in the last show, we talked a lot about the giving of the Torah and what happened that day and what was going on and a little bit about the holiday of Shavuot and some of the customs. And one of the customs is to read the story of Ruth. Now it is interesting. There are what we call the 5 Megillos. They're in Ksuvim, and there's 5 of them. There's the story of Esther with Purim. There's Song of Songs that we read on Passover. That's from King Solomon, and we have Ecclesiastes. That's Koheles that we read on the Sukkot holiday, and there's Eicha, which is from Jeremiah, which we read on Tisha B'Av, and there's a story of Ruth. Rus. I'm gonna say Rus. It's easier for me. Ruth, whatever, and it is not very long. It's all of 4 chapters. And we, in America, outside of Israel, we read it on the 2nd day of Shavuot. And in Israel, they read it on the 1st day. And it may not be a long story, but there's a lot of stuff. The fact that we are reading it on the holiday of Shavuot means there's got to be a strong connection between the story of Ruth and the holiday. Even though technically the holiday is not mentioned at all in this Megillah. So let's take ourselves back in history. Let's go through the story and let's see what we can learn from it today. So it starts out that one of the leaders of the Jewish people, his name was Elimelech. We don't know exactly where in history he was. What we do know, it's certainly after the time when Joshua entered the land of Israel. He conquers, divides up the land, about 14 years, and there's about another 350 years before we get ready to build the temple. That's called the time of the judges. There were no kings. Different tribes ended up having superstar leaders that led the Jewish people. Generally, their leadership was to protect us from outside warring nations. We've talked about Samson is one of them. We've talked about Deborah is one of them. Different leaders at different times. And this is the time of a leader called Boaz. What's interesting is, in the book of Judges, there is no Boaz. So it would seem that Boaz is one of those leaders. Some say it's Abson. But in any case, the Megillah makes it clear that it's not really important exactly at what point in history this story takes place. It's just not important enough. Now you want to start figuring out, it's the great-grandmother of King David. Okay, so it'll give you a little bit of a feeling, but not enough. In any case, there's Elimelech. Elimelech is an important leader in the tribe of Judah, and he's very wealthy. And he has a very important family. And for a strange reason, perhaps he couldn't handle giving all the charity to the poor people. There was a hunger going on. And for some reason, again, the Megillah doesn't really explain, he chooses to leave the land of Israel. That's not a good thing. He chooses to leave the land of Israel and settle in the fields of Moab. Bad choice. He has 2 sons. Um, and he has a wife. His wife's name is Nami. They leave. Now, this is a wealthy man, and he basically, I mean, sounds harsh, but he turns his back on his brothers. Somebody told me, we talked last week with stories, right? There's so much hatred out there nowadays. So if everybody is hating on the Jew, then it's time for the Jew to take care of his brethren, right? At least Jew shouldn't hate Jew, right? Right? Because it's not a because, but it's an eye-opener that you got to take care of your own. But Elimelech chose not to. It was not a good choice. So he goes to the fields of Moab, and there his two sons marry Rus and Arpa. Rus and Arpa are sisters. They are also from royalty. And debatable, they must have had some type of conversion, probably not a full-fledged conversion, enough that the children of Elimelech, whether he allowed it or not, were comfortable marrying them. They don't have children. But in this part of the story, Elimelech doesn't get it. He starts losing his money, sells all his fields back in Israel, becomes poor, dies, and then his two sons, they're there for 10 years in these fields of Moab, and those two sons, the husbands of Rus and Arpa, also die. So all we have left is Nami and her two daughter-in-laws. For the most part, it would seem her two non-Jewish daughter-in-laws. So as long as Nami's husband and sons were taking care of her in Moab, okay, stay in Moab. Her husband died, two sons died. She has two non-Jewish daughter-in-laws. Stay in the fields of Moab for what? Might as well go back to family. Someone's got to have to take care of her. Right? Why stay? And I don't think she had too much to pack up and take with her. Right? They were poor. So whatever bags she has, she packs them up, and she's starting to head back. And her two daughter-in-laws, good daughter-in-laws, say, okay, we're coming with you. And Nami says, what, are you out of your mind? Coming back for what? What, you think I'm going to go get married and have two sons and you'll wait around to marry them? Like, what could you possibly want to hang around with me for? I have nothing to offer you. No reason at all that you should stick around. Arpa doesn't press the matter. She cries, gives Nami a hug, and leaves. Rus says, I want to be Jewish. I want to be real Jewish. I want the real thing. And they start to have a discussion, and we learn actually a lot of rules and regulations about converts. We're way stricter now. But at least in those days, there were basic rules and regulations to the convert. The idea is we are not a nation, we are not a religion that was created through forced conversion, like Christianity, like Islam. Those were started by a few people. The only way for that religion to increase would be to basically force people to convert till they're big enough and they can support themselves. While Judaism was never a religion of converting people. You started with Jacob, 12 sons, Jewish people, leave Egypt, a couple million people, and we go from there. If somebody wants to convert, we accept with rules and regulations. In other words, you can't walk in and say, like, you can probably walk into a church and say, baptize me. Oh, no problem. Come right here. Okay, you're a Christian. You're done. Because we understand the ramifications. Choosing to be Jewish comes with 613 commands. Now, not all of them apply nowadays, and not all of them apply to every person. That's true. But choosing to convert is a responsibility that's going to cost a person. Right? In other words, if I tell God, okay, I want all your commands, and then I don't do them, well, I'm going to pay for that. Why would I want that? And that's really what we want the convert to understand. There's no backsies. So this is a very major decision, and I believe nowadays upwards of 2 years. Somebody comes to convert, we don't listen so fast. We take our time. My son told me a great story. I think I told it a few weeks ago about there was a certain family that in Israel, and they came to one of the great rabbis, and they said, the guy looks Jewish, dresses Jewish, speaks Hebrew, wife looks Jewish, dressed modestly, kids are going to school, and they said, we want to convert. And they said, what do you mean you want to convert? You're Jewish. No, we're Arab. I worked for the Mossad. I was a spy. But my cover was blown. So they sent me to a Jewish area to protect me. Otherwise, people were going to find me. We had to dress the part and learn the part. My wife knows all the laws of kosher better than her neighbors. We had to send our kids to Jewish school, but we never converted. So the rabbi says, so why do you want to convert now? To tell you the truth, the area we live in, the religious Jews, there's not so many left. So I'm in a synagogue, and a lot of times there's only 10 people for the minyan, and I'm one of the 10. And I walk out because I know I'm not Jewish. I can't tell them because they'll blow my cover again. And they yell at me, what are you leaving for? What am I supposed to tell them? I need to convert because I don't want to, I want them to have their minyan. So that's from the few examples that we actually let a person convert right away, because obviously he knows what's going on, right? He's been acting Jewish for years. Just he didn't want to become Jewish because, like, why? But now it affected other people, so he said, become Jewish. Anyways, and that's why the whole story of Rus, what does it have to do? The Jewish people accepted the Torah. You can't get a better conversion than that, right? That's the Jewish people converting. The whole nation became Jewish. So Rus is the story of an individual converting, and that's the conversation here. You have to teach them some of the laws, and there's death penalties for certain things, and other responsibilities. You have to teach basic what's going on, and the person has to understand what they're getting into. And once they say that they understand, and we believe that they understand what they're getting into, and they want it, then we'll accept them. So Naomi brings back Rus, and she converts, and they're living at the edge of town. Poor. Now, it seems to be interesting. The family at this point in the story has not stood up to take care of them. But it is the harvest season, which is another connection to the Shavuot holiday, because for a regular farmer, from Passover and a little bit past the Shavuot time period is when you brought in your barley, your wheat. Wheat is actually closer to the Shavuot holiday. Barley is really closer to the Passover holiday. But in any case, there's a beautiful law that we talked about a couple weeks ago, that poor people have an opportunity to take, is an interesting word, to actually take charity. What do I mean by that? When the farmer is harvesting his grain, so for everybody knows, right, you grab, again, nowadays we have vacuum cleaners, but you grab a bunch of stalks that are all dried out. You take your sickle, right, that's the half circle with a bunch of teeth, and you give a rip through all these stalks. You take a string out of your pocket, and you tie them, you put it down, and you take a step forward. And then once you have all the bundles, you've bundled up everything throughout the field, now you start gathering everything to bring it to the threshing area and the winnowing area, and that's the process. When the farmer cuts, I mean, there's just no way. Obviously, some stalks are going to fall down. So the rule is, if 1 or 2 stalks fall down, you have to leave that for the poor person. Technically, if 3 fall down, 3 or more by each cut, the farmer can pick it up, and the poor person can't touch it. You got all these poor people standing behind you. You might have to fight with them. But that's the official law. Also, if when he's gathering up all these bundles, he leaves one behind, again, the farmer cannot take it, he has to leave it for the poor person. So Rus goes, and she's walking through these fields, very modest, and she's collecting, and nothing happens, but God set it up that she should go into the field of Boaz. Boaz seems to be a nephew of Elimelech. Seems he's a nephew. So it means a relative's field. So when Boaz sees, he comes to the field, check out his field, and the harvesters are having lunch, and he says, it's funny, he noticed, who's that girl? Oh, that's Ruth the Moabite that lives with Nami. Like, she must have been famous. He knew it was a relative. So he calls her over, and he says, we're related. So I've heard such special things about how you take care of your mother-in-law, and just know it doesn't go unnoticed, and I'm so happy you're in my field, so stay in my field. I'll tell the boys they can't yell at you, they can't touch you, they can't bother you, so you'll be safe, number one. And if you're thirsty, come to the tent, take a drink. There's always food here, right? The workers, they get thirsty, they get tired, they're hot, they need a bite. They can come. You have permission. Normally, the poor people don't come to this tent. This is for my workers. But you're a relative. If you want to come to the tent, please feel free to go to that tent, and I'll take care of you. She thanks her very much, and he tells the workers, if she takes more than she's allowed, don't say a word. If you think she's not getting enough, you keep dropping a few extra for her. Make sure she gets a lot. And she ends up going home that day with a humongous amount of grain. Like a whole measure, like not just like a couple bags, but a real amount. And she comes home, and Nami says, what happened over here? This is not a normal amount. And she tells him the whole story. Wow. And Nami says, that's Boaz. He's our relative. And he's, okay, great. You hang out in his fields. Do what he says. Don't go to other fields. And throughout the harvest season, Rus is collecting all this grain. And for poor people, this grain, you need it for months and months and months and months because it's food. After the entire harvest season, so the fields are now empty, so Nami says to Rus, she says, we got to take care of you. This Boaz is a relative. Now there's a command that relatives have to redeem their fields, the family fields of relatives that were poor. So technically, Boaz has a mitzvah to redeem these fields and give back to us. And wouldn't it be a nice idea? This Boaz should marry you. It's not exactly Yibum because, again, she was married to Machlon, and Machlon is at best a cousin. There's no real mitzvah of Yibum on a cousin. And perhaps Rus wasn't fully Jewish, so there's for sure no command of Yibum. But it's almost like she sort of put an attachment to the field. You want the mitzvah of redeeming the field? Marry Rus as well. So that night, Rus goes to the fields. In those days, the owners would sleep outside because you had to be worried that the thieves would come, right? Thieves are not stealing from your field, right, when the stalks are standing. Like, they'll wait till you do all the work, and you're left with your grain, and then they'll come steal. So it was normal the owner of a field would hang around outside. So Rus goes in the middle of the night, and she uncovers his feet, and she goes to sleep, and Boaz wakes up, and he says, what's going on here? Who are you? Who is this? And Rus says, me. But you have a mitzvah. You need to redeem the fields, and you need to redeem me. You need to marry me. So Boaz says, wow, such a special girl. You didn't just hang out with the boys, but we're talking about a mitzvah over here. So the problem is I'll do it in a heartbeat, but I have to offer it to my uncle because my uncle is a close relative. But if he doesn't want, I'm the next closest relative, and I'll take care of it. Rus stays the night. She leaves early the next morning, and he gives her some food to take home, and she goes back to Nami, and Nami says, if Boaz says that he's going to take care of it. You can be sure that it'll happen today, which is amazing. We call that zrizus, not delaying, just doing things immediately. So he goes to the city gate. It seems the city gate is where the courts would sit, and Boaz was one of the heads of the court. And he sees the uncle who goes nameless in the Megillah because he chooses not to do the mitzvah. And he calls him over and he says in front of the court, he says, we have fields that have to be redeemed from Elimelech, and no one's redeemed them, and he's the closest relative. If he doesn't want it, I'll do it. So the relative says, sure thing, of course I'll do it. He says, yeah, but Naomi attached, I'm not sure how she did this, but Naomi attached the caveat, you got to marry Rus as well. That the relative said, I can't do. Why not? This was the raging question going on during those days. And that was, the Torah says, a male convert from Moab cannot marry into the Jewish people. He's Jewish, but he can't marry into the Jewish people. While ladies, a lady from Moab was questionable. If she converted, could you marry her? That was the raging question. Now Boaz himself declared that that you could marry a lady from Moab. But this relative said, your court says today, yes, that's how you're interpreting the Torah verse, but what if in 50 years from now, the next court changes their mind, right? So now what? It'll be too late for my kids because they'll all be Moabites and I wasn't allowed to marry her. I can't take that chance. So if you want, Boaz, you do it. So Boaz says, no problem. I'm in. And Boaz marries her that night. And Boaz is dead the next day. He was that young. So him having Zriza's alacrity, not delaying, he married Ruth. She becomes pregnant from that night. And from there comes King David. Another connection to the story of Shavuot is the yard site of King David is the second day of Shavuos. And King David is obviously where the Messiah comes from. So this, by the way, something we said in the last show that we learned from the different customs on the short holiday that nothing just comes, right? There's no such thing as instant gratification. This story leading up to the birth of King David has a lot of twists and turns in it. And the story of Rus happens to be just one of those twists and turns. So it's interesting. We're talking about different aspects of why we read the story of Rus on the short holiday. And it's interesting that Rus is a very modest person. Modesty is a very Jewish attribute. It's expected. We teach our girls in school. We expect them to dress modestly. We explain the beauty of modesty. I don't have to walk around the streets being naked. I have to have self-worth for my body. While her sister Arpa was the opposite. It says once she left Nami, she made herself available, I don't have to explain more than that, to a whole squadron of soldiers. Who comes from Rus? King David comes from Rus. Who comes from Arpa? That famous giant, Goliath. And Goliath, in the time of King Saul, he was the Philistine, I don't know if he was a general, but he was like their tank, right? He was their fighting machine. And he came out every morning for 40 days, it says. He came out every morning and said, you Jews, you're this, you're that. And he cursed them out and he cursed God out. He says, who has the guts to fight me? Mano a mano. Why make a whole war? I'll fight one of you. Whoever wins, they win. Now, of course, it never works that way, right? If you lose, then they say, see, look, we won. If they lose, somehow they change the rules. But in any case, for 40 days, some say, Talmud says, that it was like a reward for and curse out God. And King David comes and he defeats him. And I wish you all a happy, healthy holiday of Shavuot. Enjoy the cheesecake. The music is playing. I hope you enjoyed it short and sweet. Thank you, of course, to all wonderful sponsor listeners. I can't do it without you. Thank you to the production team. We have Alan in the back today. I hope I've left you some food for thought. Until next time, I'm Rabbi Tzvi Jacobson. You've been listening to Let's Talk Torah on NRM Streamcast. And until next time, don't forget to think about it.
There's a house we can build. Every room inside is filled with things from far